A cold wind pushed through the broken streets of Berlin in late April 1945, carrying the smell of smoke that never seemed to lift. The city was quiet in a way that felt unnatural, as if every building were holding its breath. Shells had stopped falling for a moment, only a moment, and in that short pause, an American officer stepped over a twisted beam and into what had once been an office. He didn't speak. No one did. The rubble under his boots made more sound than the men beside him. Light slipped through a hole in the ceiling, catching bits of paper drifting in the air like tired snow. Most of the sheets were blank or burned at the edges. Some held stamps of the Reich, now smeared and nearly meaningless. The officer, tired, soot-covered, running on hours of nerves, kneeled beside a desk that had been crushed against a wall. From beneath the splinters, something dark stuck out. Leather. He pulled at it gently, expecting nothing more than another scorched ledger. Instead, a small black book slid free. Its cover was warm from the fires still smoldering outside. The pages inside were cramped with names, ranks, addresses, tiny notes in sharp handwriting. He didn't know what he held, not yet, but he felt its weight in a way that wasn't physical. The men around him shifted, waiting for any hint of danger. Berlin still had pockets of gunfire, snipers, mines. The officer stayed low, turning the book with careful hands, aware that this ruined city was giving up secrets one brick at a time. Far in the distance, a dull explosion rolled through the streets. Dust shook from the ceiling. The officer tucked the small book inside his coat without a word. In a place where everything was coming apart, he had found something oddly intact, something that didn't belong to the chaos. He didn't know who would want it. He only knew someone would. A pale morning light filtered through the windows of a quiet office in Washington, D.C. on 13th of June, 1942. On that day, President Franklin D. Roosevelt signed an order creating the Office of Strategic Services, the first centralized American intelligence agency. It replaced the earlier loosely organized Coordinator of Information, an attempt begun in 1941 when the U.S. realized that secret warfare demanded coordination beyond what the Army, Navy, and FBI could manage alone. At the helm stood William J. Donovan, Wild Bill, a decorated veteran of the First World War, a lawyer, a thinker, a man trusted to build something new. Under him, OSS recruited artists and mechanics, journalists and linguists, engineers and dreamers, people selected less by background than by what they could bring. Cunning, bravery, a willingness to slip into shadows. The mission of OSS was quiet but deadly clear. Gather information, sabotage enemy war efforts, support resistance movements, spread propaganda when needed, and operate behind enemy lines in ways that regular armies could not. Across Europe, Asia, Africa. Wherever the war reached, OSS quietly spread thin networks. Some teams parachuted into occupied France as part of Jedburgh operations. Others connected with exiles, underground resistances, secret contacts in neutral nations. Radio codes flickered across borders. Hidden resistance fighters carried small radios, forged papers, whispered names, all under the OSS umbrella. In one sense, the OSS was a bridge between war and the world that would come after. It introduced the idea that intelligence, secret, careful, clever, could shape outcomes the way armies shaped battlefields. After the war ended, the OSS was disbanded, but its memory lived on. Its methods, its people, its instinct for secrecy and subtle power formed the roots of what later became the Central Intelligence Agency. In that small office on that quiet June morning, a new kind of war began. One fought not with rifles and tanks, but with whispers, codes, shadows, and the sharp edge of secret knowledge. Even before the last shells fell, the bones of the Third Reich had begun to crumble. By late 1944 and early 1945, the armies of the Allies and the Soviet Union pressed into German territory from all sides, pushing back the Nazi forces on every front. By March 1945, as the capital prepared for a final stand, the Nazi leadership scrambled. Many government offices, military headquarters, ministries, foreign policy offices began an urgent, chaotic retreat. Files were ordered destroyed or hastily packed up. Some archives were sent toward more remote regions. Others were simply abandoned in the panic. In those final days, across bombed-out ministries, gutted offices, crushed basements and empty floors, sheets of paper fluttered like ashes. Some were singed, others soaked, many illegible. Entire record rooms sat silent, their contents scattered or hidden or left behind in the rush. When the armies finally entered, the Soviets into Berlin, others across shattered Germany, they found more than broken walls. They discovered silences filled with lost voices, documents, letters, diaries, ledgers, files of the Secretariat, ministries, intelligence units, some destroyed, but many still there, waiting under rubble or behind locked doors, or in basements where even the dust had settled. It was a moment both fragile and urgent, for these files were more than paper. They were the shadow of a regime, its orders, its secrets, its crimes. And now, as the Reich dissolved, those shadows lay scattered. Whoever retrieved them first might wield something heavier than war, memory. One by one, Allied intelligence units, document teams, and investigators began to comb through the ruins. Houses once occupied by officials, government offices stripped by panic, hidden basements, warehouses forgotten during retreat. In some places, entire caches of Nazi paperwork survived. They gathered during early May 1945, after the death of Adolf Hitler, and just days before the final surrender on 8th May. What emerged from those ruined buildings was not just fragments, in many cases entire archives, intact or partially intact, that the Nazis had meant to destroy were instead handed over to history. Yet among the files, chaos reigned. Pages were missing, some records were burned or water damaged, official seals smudged, entire volumes dissolved under the weight of fire, war, and neglect. What remained was partial, fragmented, imperfect. Still out in that rubble, amid what the war had thrown away, the Allies had a chance to rebuild truth, to preserve evidence, to piece together what the vanished Reich had done. The collapse of Nazi Germany was more than military defeat. It was a reckoning, and everywhere, in battered basements and blackened offices, the wreckage offered a strange kind of hope. But hope is rarely neat. Many documents never resurfaced, others were altered, some disappeared in the chaos of post-war claims, and even among what remained, the truth would not always be obvious. One silent archive at a time, the task began. Yet what they found, what stayed, would shape the trials, the memory, the reckoning for decades to come. Mist draped over Berlin's broken streets as Allied soldiers worked their way through the ruin. Among the scattered papers and singed files, there emerged something that looked out of place, a small, leather-bound book filled with names. Few could gauge its value yet, but those names, that list, might hold the pulse of a crumbling empire. This book, a directory supposedly belonging to Adolf Hitler, contained contact numbers and addresses of many senior figures of the Nazi regime. Heinrich Himmler, Joseph Goebbels, Hermann Göring, Rudolf Hess, Joachim von Ribbentrop, Albert Speer, and Martin Bormann, among many others. The value of such a directory went beyond simple names. In those few hundred pages lay a map of power. Phone numbers, addresses, personal contacts, all details that could help piecing together how decisions were made, how orders flowed, how networks inside the regime were woven. For those who survived, those who fought the war's aftermath, this book promised evidence of who talked to whom, who had influence, who might have given orders. One striking detail, the book listed many top officials, but not Hitler himself. That absence deepened the mystery. Why omit the primary name? Some historians and analysts believe that the directory belonged to Hitler precisely because his name was missing, suggesting that he used a separate, more secure record. Tucked inside the book was even a letter from Goebbels' private secretary, a personal trace of daily life in the Nazi high command. If genuine, this book was more than a relic. It was a key, a link to the inner workings of a regime that thrived on secrecy, a quiet ledger that might crack open old doors. And when such doors had been sealed by bombs and fear, this little book might be the first to pry them open. But with that hope came a question steeped in doubt. Was this truly Hitler's book, or a near copy, a fake, a dangerous myth waiting to mislead? A few fragile pages held the promise of truth, yet even truth can tremble on paper, especially in the ashes of war. A thin gray morning light spilled over the ruins of what had once been the Reich Chancellery in Berlin. Broken walls, shattered windows, ceilings half collapsed, corridors choked with dust and wood. Cracked plaster clung in grimy ribbons, ceilings moaned under the weight of debris. Inside that quiet ruin, a handful of British officers moved carefully, boots crunching on plaster and splintered floorboards. One among them, Captain John Hodge, paused by a collapsed writing desk. The desk had been crushed against a wall, half buried beneath a tangle of beams. Hodge crouched, shoved aside a few pieces of wood, and saw the edge of something dark, lean and leather-bound. He drew it out gently as if afraid it might crumble under his fingers. The object was a small book, surprisingly whole, considering the building's ruined state. Its leather cover was scorched at the edges, but still soft. Inside were pages filled with names of high-ranking officials of the regime still reeling under collapse. Phone numbers, addresses, personal annotations. The mood among the men shifted. This was more than debris. This was not just a scrap. The silence that surrounded them felt heavier, heavy with the import of what that book might mean. In a city stripped bare, in a government ground to dust, this relic carried a peculiar weight. According to post-war accounts, that book was later identified as the directory belonging, possibly, to Adolf Hitler. The fact that it was found among the ruins of the Reich Chancellery gave it a strange kind of gravity. But the story of its discovery was, at first, just a whisper. In the rubble, no one shouted, no one celebrated. Hodge tucked the book under his coat. It would surface years later, sold at auction. For a moment in that silent ruin, a small object, a book, became a thread, pulling history back together. A fragile thread, yes, but enough to make people pause, enough to make them wonder. Rain had begun that night, soft pattering on shattered rooftops, a sky choking with smoke and cold. Somewhere beyond the ruins, distant voices drifted. Amongst that uneasy quiet, a small group of men moved like shadows, carrying crates, sacks, and one small leather-bound book that demanded to be kept close. They belonged to Office of Strategic Services, OSS, or to Allied units working with them, intelligence officers, counterintelligence agents, men trained for subtle missions rather than open battle. The war was ending, but their work had only begun. They worked quietly because the city was still dangerous. Mines, stray bullets, stray soldiers. Danger lingered, even amid surrender. The goal was simple on paper. Find documents, gather evidence, prevent whatever remained of the old regime from erasing itself entirely. But in practice, it was a gamble. Heimat offices, ministries, villas. All over Germany, people were smuggling or burning papers. What remained often sat in rubble, hidden basements, wrecked buildings. OSS and Allied teams raced against time. In one early mission, a U.S. Army counterintelligence group, later credited with saving some of the most important records, discovered at a paper mill in Freiman a batch of files the Nazi leadership had shipped there to be pulped. The files contained membership cards to the Nazi Party, records of the SA, administrative and court documents, a massive archive of association and complicity. Soldiers and agents loaded massive piles, cartons, crates, each heavy with paper, evidence, accountability. Every bundle felt like a confession. They carried the weight, but also carried the risk. If caught, those papers could be destroyed or used to mislead. They shipped them not casually, with care, to military safe houses, document centers, sometimes all the way to Allied headquarters in newly occupied zones. But that night, under rain and dust and falling light, the small leather book, the directory from the ruins, was wrapped in a cloth, tucked into a coat, passed hand to hand. No fuss, no flags, no fanfare, just quiet determination. By morning, the documents began their slow exodus. hidden in trucks and diplomatic pouches, sometimes disguised as worthless debris. Some destined for analysis rooms in Berlin, others for secure depots, where analysts would start the long work of reading names, tracing networks. Few people knew what was coming, but the files, the papers, the book, were leaving Germany's rubble behind. Bound for secrets, for evidence, the first thing that struck the analyst was how ordinary it all looked. Phone numbers, street addresses, notes short enough to feel casual. But nothing in that book was casual, not in those years. They paused over Heinrich Himmler's contact information, the man who controlled the SS, the police, the concentration camp system. Then over Joseph Goebbels, who had shaped propaganda with a precision colder than steel. And Albert Speer, the Reich's armaments minister who kept factories running long after reason had crumbled. Every name carried a shadow. But it wasn't the famous names that made the analysts lean in. It was the unexpected ones, lesser-known officers, regional party leaders, secretaries, diplomats, logistics coordinators, people who might never appear in a headline but who helped the machinery move. A regime never runs only on its giants. It runs on the hands hidden behind them. Patterns started to form. The same Berlin neighborhood repeated more often than chance allowed. Certain regions of Bavaria appeared again and again, hinting at clusters of influence. Some entries were crossed out but not erased completely. Others had small pencil marks beside them, as though someone once meant to revisit the page and never returned. And there was the odd absence. Adolf Hitler's own name. Not once. Not in shorthand. Not a hint of where he might have been reached. Analysts debated quietly. Some believed it made the book even more plausible as something he used. After all, a man in his position wouldn't need to write himself down. Others suggested it had belonged to someone extremely close to him, close enough to have numbers for the highest ranks, yet careful enough to keep certain things unwritten. Hours slipped by. Coffee cooled. No one raised their voice. The book's power wasn't loud. It was slow, steady, like watching ink reveal something beneath the surface. Every page suggested a trail. Every trail hinted at someone not yet questioned. And every name, even the small ones, carried the faint echo of a decision made in the dark. But tucked between those lines was something harder to place. A detail so small, the analysts didn't know what to do with it yet. A detail that would come back later, quietly, when no one expected it. A single lamp flickered in the basement room where the analysts worked, its glow trembling each time footsteps passed overhead. Papers covered the table, notebooks, transcripts. The leather directory lay open, its spine worn a little more each day. Yet for all the work poured into those pages, doubt crept in from the edges like cold air. One afternoon, just after 3:00 p.m., a young interpreter hurried in with a set of numbers traced from a different pile of seized documents. He placed them beside an entry in the directory. Same handwriting, same style of abbreviations, same careful slant of the pen. For a moment, everyone leaned closer. It felt like two fragments of the same hidden world might finally touch. But the excitement faded fast. The second document had come from a building partly looted before Allied troops arrived. No one could say who had handled it. No one could guarantee it hadn't been altered in those last chaotic days when officials fled and desperate civilians scavenged anything that looked valuable or burnable. A single forged page could send investigators down a path that wasted days, weeks, maybe more. Worse still were the near misses. Twice, small fires broke out in buildings where captured documents were being sorted. One blaze destroyed an entire stack of local party records rescued near Potsdam. Another smoldered through the night in a requisitioned schoolhouse used as a temporary depot. The fire brigade arrived before the whole structure went up, but the smell of scorched paper carried a sting that stayed with the men who breathed it in. And then there were the pages missing from the book itself. Clean tears, no scorch marks, no water stains. Torn out by a hand that had time to choose carefully. Analysts passed the book around under the dim light, each one pausing on the jagged edges, wondering what was on those vanished lines. A name, an address, a hint at someone who slipped away when the war broke open. Rumors drifted through the intelligence circles too. Someone claimed a second directory existed. Someone else insisted that Soviet troops had carried one out of Berlin early on, tucked under the arm of an officer who never spoke about it again. None of this could be confirmed. None of it could be dismissed. The maze only grew. Still, the analysts pressed on. They worked through nights that blurred into mornings, stepping around puddles left by leaking ceilings, brushing soot from their sleeves, guarding every scrap of information as if it might disappear the moment they looked away. Yet a quiet thought lingered at the back of every mind in that crowded room. If the missing pages were taken on purpose, then someone, somewhere, still had them. And whatever was written there might change everything they thought they knew. The room was hushed. In a courtroom far from the ruins, in Nuremberg trials, stacks of papers and captured records sat heavy on a long table. Among them, files pulled from destroyed offices, ledgers rescued from basements, membership lists, correspondence, and fragments of a fallen regime. These were not relics. They were proof. Between November 1945 and August 1946, the first round of the trials prosecuted 24 high-ranking leaders of the fallen regime, men who had once carried vast power. The prosecution needed evidence, and the documents captured from destroyed Nazi buildings, archives, offices, even paper mills gave them that. The directory and many similar captured records became part of a larger collection preserved by what came to be known as the Berlin Document Center, BDC. The BDC gathered personnel files, party membership cards, correspondence, official orders, material that could link individuals to actions, to affiliations, to crimes. At trials, prosecutors confronted defendants not with memories or hearsay, but with the regime's own paperwork. Orders, memos, transport lists, lists of victims, internal correspondence, registration files of the secret police, the SS, and other Nazi organizations. The paper trail became a burden the guilty could not lift. Many cases, these documents provided the only direct link between bureaucratic paperwork and real-world horror, between names on a list and lives destroyed. Without them, proving systematic crimes, tracing the chain of command, holding individuals responsible would have been far harder. As months turned into years, thousands of files, membership records, SS personnel files, letters, notes, helped with denazification efforts across Germany and beyond. The goal was to dismantle the structures that made the regime possible, not just to punish, but to rebuild. That small directory, perhaps one of many, was no longer just a curious relic. It had become part of a great reckoning, a ledger of power, complicity, and human cost. And in the silence of courts and archives, its names echoed loud. There was a night when one OSS officer sat alone at a metal table, the kind that wobbled if you leaned on it wrong. A single bulb hung overhead, humming softly. In front of him lay folders taken from ruined buildings, some still smelling faintly of smoke, along with the small black directory that had quietly shaped so many hours of work. He turned a page and paused, not because of the name written there, but because of the quiet question that had been growing in him for weeks. How far should a victor reach into the private world of the defeated, even the world of a regime responsible for so much pain? The war had ended, but the habit of secrecy lingered. Intelligence work meant holding what others once guarded, even if that meant reading letters never meant for foreign eyes, examining lists that once circulated only in high offices, tracing the threads of friendships, loyalties, betrayals. Some officers told themselves the answer was simple. The regime had no right to privacy after what it had done. The files were evidence, nothing more. Every page pulled from the rubble was one step closer to truth, justice, and the chance to prevent lies from rewriting the past. Others felt a quieter conflict. Paper doesn't choose the hands that find it. Some documents contained the names of people who had lived in fear, who survived by staying invisible. Some belonged to secretaries, drivers, families caught near the machinery of power without ever touching its levers. A few analysts spoke in hushed tones about the weight of knowing more about a stranger's life than their own relatives ever would. They read the handwriting of men and women who never imagined these pages would outlive them, much less be used in courtrooms or filed in archives continents away. There were darker questions too. If a file revealed a name that might lead to an arrest, could an analyst be certain the context was intact, that the page wasn't torn, altered, taken out of order during the chaos? One wrong interpretation could stain a life forever. Yet doing nothing risked allowing the guilty to vanish into the post-war years, unnoticed and unchallenged. So the work continued, steady, careful, uneasy. Somewhere between justice and intrusion lay a thin line, and the men who handled those fragile papers walked it every day. By midnight, the officer closed the directory and rested his hand on the cover for a long moment. Not out of reverence, but out of recognition. The book was a reminder that truth is rarely clean. It comes with shadows, with doubts, with decisions that echo long after the war itself fades. He stood, switched off the lamp, and left the room quiet again. Some questions, he realized, would follow him long after. The paperwork was filed away.